start filming a little bit. So, who are you?
I'm Dave Treadwell. I am Vice President of the .NET Developer Platform team here at Microsoft.
Now, you're a Vice President here at Microsoft?
Yes, I am.
Well, you don't. You have an office like mine.
I'm not too formal on that kind of casual.
That's actually one thing I like about Microsoft is the flatness of the organization, and certainly when you see people's offices, that sort of is a metaphor for how flat the organization is.
What's always been a principle that we've pursued is keeping the decisions as much at the periphery as possible, because frankly the people close to the problems know better how to solve them than I do in general.
Yeah. Now, it's a big month coming up for the DevDiv's, right?
That's right.
You're in the developer division.
Yeah, just let me describe it quickly. Where I am, I run essentially half of the developer division. I do the .NET platform stuff, which means the .NET framework, the CLR, ASP.NET's in my team, the Compact framework, and a few general divisional things like the UE teams, the localization teams, the WinFX SDK, and the engineering group is also in my team.
Okay. And Avalon's in a different, or Windows Presentation Foundation is in a different team.
Yeah,
right?
WPF, actually another sort of responsibility I have implicitly in Microsoft is shepherding the WinFX technologies. Okay. So I work closely with the Avalon team, I work closely with the Indigo folks, the Workflow Foundation folks, WinFS, all those teams I sort of help, but none of them are organizationally in my team.
Right. Now, November 7th, what's going on there?
We got the Would-Be launch.
Would-Be
in
launch.
Yukon, I should say.
And you guys are in the final days of making sure the bits are perfect and all that fun stuff.
Yeah, basically where we are right now is we're in escrow, which means that the code is essentially done, we believe. We're doing our final deep test passes, looking for anything that we might have missed. This is always a scary time of project for someone like me, because if we do find something serious, it can be very difficult to fix it, because we don't want to upset the apple cart and risk causing something to be worse than it already is, which changes late in the product cycle. There's always that danger.
Yeah. No, it's an interesting time. So you guys just hit ZBB last night, right?
Well, for the escrow period, we've actually been in ZBB for a little while now. We're in the...
Explain what that is, 'cause for people outside. Even I've worked here for 2.5 years, and I still don't really understand the processes of how, what ZBB means and sort of what it means to Microsoft and what it might mean to a customer on the outside.
So there's several stages of the product that we go through. In terms of the general approach, you might have an M0 or milestone 0, which is where you do your planning and kind of figure out what you want to do in the release. Okay. Then you'll have a series of development milestones, M1 through M, whatever you work it out to be, to do a kind of a sprint developing a lot of new code, and then you go through a stabilization period, and each of the milestones are structured that way.
Yeah.
As you get later in the product, we introduce milestones like ZBB. The concept of ZBB stands for Zero Bug Bounce. And the idea is you clear out the backlog of bugs that you care about. You essentially get to the point where we're always going to have some incoming bugs, but you get to the point where there's not a backlog of stuff that we have to go address. And that's really a key stability milestone, because it lets us know that we're really on top of everything right then.
Now, bugs are everything from a really major bug that crashes your machine to something where there might be a pixel that's wrong.
Yeah, it's the whole suite of things. We have different severities and priorities to try and track these things.
But when I was on the customer, a bug has one connotation to me, right? It's bad.
Right.
But now that I'm here at Microsoft, I see that there's bad bugs, bugs that hang a machine, and then there's bugs that are just maybe minor annoyances or stuff like that.
Yeah, and there's that whole range. Anytime the product doesn't work like it's supposed to, is some class of bug. And one thing that has always been the case in the software industry, but it's getting more broadly known, is that we ship products that aren't perfect. We ship products that we believe are excellent and have a very high level of quality, but if one pixel is out of place in one screen, we might be okay with that bug. But if it crashes your machine or reformats your hard disk, or if it's a security hole, okay, that's something we take super seriously. We're clearly going to fix it. So there's a whole range of severity of bugs that we look at.
Why is it impossible to build perfect software?
Boy, that's almost a metaphysical question.
I guess one of the answers I've heard is that is it possible to write a perfect poem or take a perfect photograph?
That's not a bad answer, actually. The reality is software is so complex. There's so many different things that it can do. Having it handle absolutely every single possible scenario, when you're talking about millions of lines of code, where each line of code represents potentially many minutes of thought, having it be completely perfect across all of those dimensions and integrating them all together very effectively is just it's an engineering challenge that's beyond what humankind is up to at this point in time.
Yeah.
Now, of course, as we're up-leveling more and more the software that we're building.
What is up-leveling?
By up-leveling, I mean, think of 1985 when you were writing code, you were writing assembly code, you're telling the machine, move this bit to this register, this to this memory location, very detailed coding.
Yeah.
Okay? By up-leveling it, now you don't move this bit to this register, you call an API. It does a whole bunch of things under the cover for you.
Or the new way is almost intentional programming, right? You tell the computer sort of what you want it to
Your
have.
intent, as opposed to being specific about the steps to achieve the intent.
Yeah, like I want the screen to display my information, and then the system figures out how many columns to put it in, and what font to use and what size of font. You're not hard coding that anymore like you would back in the 80s.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I mean by up-leveling is you do more in terms of specifying where each bit is moving around in the computer, and you're specifying much, much higher level concepts. And if you look at things like the web, they're really only able to exist because humans now don't have to think about moving this bit to this register. They think about a higher level concept which they can reason about more effectively.
Interesting. Where should we go next? What are you proudest of in Visual Studio?
In Visual Studio, proudest of? I think that the big thing to me, and I'm biased because I'm in this side of the group, but the way that we're modernizing the developer platform, and this is very consistent with the discussion we just had about up-leveling. Yeah. The fact that we have taken Win32 and VB6 and the platforms that were prevalent in the 90s, and we have a much more modern platform that's a heck of a lot easier to use. We have...
Do you have an example of how it's easier to use?
Yeah. One good example is garbage collection. We talk about this one a lot. The idea that you now don't have to worry about managing all your memory. There's always this whole thing about you allocate memory, you free memory, you got to be careful that the allocates and the frees match up. It's a lot of work to do that. I started as a developer myself at Microsoft and spent a fair amount of time debugging memory leaks. I've been at Microsoft a little over 16 years now.
Wow. So you've seen quite a range of change.
It's a different place than it was when I started.
It's been a different place since I started, and I've only been here 2.5 years or so.
Yeah, it's a lot different. I started writing code in the NT team way back in 1989 on the file server.
Yeah.
And so I was dealing with low-level details, moving this bit to this register, that kind of stuff. And so I'm most proud of the fact that we've taken that platform and the concepts, and it's at a much higher level now,
right,
where a user doesn't need to think as much about, or a developer doesn't need to think about those details so much. The system handles a lot of that complexity for them, so that the developer can concentrate on the problem that they have to solve, rather than on the plumbing needed to implement that problem.
Yeah. Are there any other good examples of things that used to take hundreds of lines of code or hours to do that now take minutes? Or
well, I think ASP.NET across the board is an example of that. If you look at the way people built websites, even in the late 90s, they had to be very prescriptive on, here's where we're going to put this HTML tag, and here's how we handle this function. And if you look at what we've done with ASP.NET and Visual Web Developer as the platform and the tools that go together, now you kind of design your website, and the underlying mechanics of how that thing gets implemented, the data shows up or the formatting looks good. It's so much simpler than manually specifying HTML tags, or you're really abstracted away from a lot of the details. You can concentrate on how you want the website to look and to behave.
Yeah. How do you, as a VP, how do you know who to listen to? I imagine, Microsoft technologies are used in so many different places and different contexts and different devices in different ways. How do you know, I'm sure you're involved in planning out the next version of Visual Studio. I think it's codenamed Orcus, right?
That's correct, yeah.
And then there's Hawaii after that,
yeah,
right? And how do you know who to listen to and what to put in the product?
Well, that's a tricky thing. One thing is you listen to lots of people. Most of my job is email, meetings, basically communicating with people at one level or another. So you get input from a very broad set of people, both internally at Microsoft and externally with customers. Customers are honestly some of our best input, and a major initiative that we push in this division the last couple of years is to get much more open and transparent with our customer base. You look at the blogs or Ladybug for bug filing, all those kinds of things are examples of how we're connecting with customers. So you listen to a lot of people. Now, who do you listen to most? Because you don't listen to everybody the same amount, just because I can't have an equal relationship with the millions of people that use our products. Well, a couple of different layers. One is, in terms of customers, the people who engage most deeply with our product. There are a number of customers that I talk to on a fairly regular basis. about what's working well, where we can do better, that kind of thing. And when there's a give and take where they're giving me advice on take the product this way, and if it makes sense and it's represented by their customers, then that's a great way for me to know that this is somebody I trust, I have a relationship with, we've built a little community here that works. Yeah. Internally, the high-level concepts are very similar. There's tons of people I talk to internally on different classes of issues, and you get a sense over time of who has good insights on what kinds of issues. Yeah. And so if it's like a certain architectural question about how the CLR is formed, I always know that I can knock on Jason Sanders' door and get a solid answer. If it's about how to run our engineering processes, Anton Horowitz is awesome for it. If it's about the best way to appeal to web developers, well, Shanku and Scott Guthrie and the ASP.NET team are fantastic in those areas. So per area, you get a sense of who the experts are, who has good instincts, who has good expertise in a problem space.
Yeah. Do you worry that you're missing something?
Of course.
Yeah.
I'm constantly making decisions on 30% of the data I wish I had to make the decision. And you go with your gut. You try and make the decision stick. Sometimes you're wrong. If new data is revealed after you've made a decision, sometimes you revisit the decisions. Yeah. But it's constantly a matter of do the best you can with the available data. Have a good sense of when you have enough data to make a decision. Sometimes you want to be fast with decisions, but if you're too fast, you can be wrong. So there's a real balance there, and it's a tricky one for me.
Yeah. On the street, development methodologies change a little bit, right? When you talk to kids who are going to college
Yep.
or whatnot. And are you trying to figure out how to stay up to date with the latest techniques? Because that's probably where the innovator's dilemma is going to, where the disruptive technologies are going to come.
Oh, absolutely. And the development is always changing the way it works, both the specific things that people do, but also the ways they go about doing it. Concepts like extreme programming and the Scrum process. These are new concepts that are getting more formalized. One of the things that's cool about Whidbey, not in my team, but Rick LaPlante's group, the things that they're doing with the enterprise SKUs in Visual Studio to really help formalize the process of development in a lot of different ways. Yep. And we look very closely at the things people are doing in order both to use it internally in our own engineering teams, but also to ensure that our tools do as good a job as possible of allowing people to use the development processes that they want to use.
Right. On the way up here, I met a couple of guys who are already working on Hawaii, which is probably a few years.
Yeah, in this hallway, there's a bunch of folks working on a lot of different stuff.
What kinds of feedback do you want to hear from customers right now for something that might not appear for 2 or 3 years?
I would say, what are the major features you want to see in the tools and the underlying platform? We have we feel, very good tool with Visual Studio. It's really best in class in the industry in a lot of different ways. But what are the fundamental kind of foundational changes that we ought to make so that it can help you build better software? There's these new processes we're talking about, like extreme programming, that kind of thing that are coming down the pike. How can we best fit our tools with those kinds of processes that you want to develop your software with?
Yeah.
Related to that, what are the biggest challenges you face in building your applications? Building an application is still a relatively complex thing to do. What is hardest for you? What are ways that Microsoft can take on some of that complexity, put it into Visual Studio, so you don't have to deal with some of that complexity, and it's easier for you to put your application together?
Now, do you build tools for internal? Where I'm going with this, Wall Street Journal just ran an article on the Windows Vista team and how they had basically scrapped early versions of Windows Vista, or Longhorn back then, right, and redo them and change the way the development's being done, because there's a few thousand people working on Windows Vista.
Yep.
Probably one of the bigger software projects in the world, if not the biggest.
It's probably the biggest software project in the history of mankind, I would guess.
Yeah.
This is a massive project. You asked if we develop internal tools. We do. It's not our official job is to develop Visual Studio.
Yeah.
But one thing that we have a very strong culture at Microsoft is dogfooding.
Yeah.
Using our own stuff. And a lot of the tools that we use, like, for example, the C compilers, everybody uses the C compilers, whether it's in Vista or over here, those are the compilers that are used internally at Microsoft.
Right.
C# and .NET Framework, CLR, those are used in specific areas inside Microsoft and fairly deeply. However, the developers are not responsible for all the internal tools. There are a fair number of things that other teams use for their development practices. And one of the longer-term initiatives we have is where those tools make sense, we likely will productize them, and it's kind of bi-directional. A lot of the things in the enterprise SKUs, like the profilers and whatnot, started off as internal-only research kinds of projects that are now important parts of the Visual Studio Enterprise SKUs. Likewise, we're finding certain parts of the Enterprise SKUs are going to be directly applicable to how we manage our own internal projects. So there's a two-way street there, really.
Yeah. You're really in charge of the team that's sort of deciding the future of Windows, aren't you?
Well, in some ways. I mean, I won't take credit for all of Windows.
Well, I mean, Windows is definitely moving toward the WinFX, and .NET. I mean, Windows developers certainly are moving that way, right?
Well, that was what I was going to say. If you look at developers, our teams really are at the heart of the developer answer for Windows. And when you strip away Windows, really the most important customers of Windows are the developers. People don't buy Windows for its own sake. Windows by itself, you can run solitaire, you can use Notepad, but it's fairly uninteresting by itself. Windows is cool because of the applications people built on top of it. Developers building those applications is really the center of the Windows value proposition. And so in those areas, my teams are very involved because the primary thrust of our developer platform these days is WinFX and .NET and those related technologies.
Yeah. Where's it all going? I mean, and maybe to understand where it's going, maybe take us back to why we developed .NET.
Sure.
Yeah.
So looking back several years, if you go back to about 1997, the company had a great release of Windows NT. They had Windows 95 out in the marketplace. Developers were using Win32 and VB6 on top of these operating systems and being very successful with it. A couple of major trends were happening in the industry, though. The web was, by that point in time, very prevalent. It was clear that everything was going to move toward the internet and toward the web. Also, our historical sort of flat C interfaces and VB on top of it were starting to show their age. We had Java as an example of a very good modern programming language that makes a lot of kinds of development easier. We knew how hard it is to write certain kinds of code using just C or C++ and programming to flat DLL APIs. Yeah. So we started an initiative basically to completely modernize the developer platform. In the early days it was called Project 42, but basically we had grand ambitions to change everything. And over the course of a couple of years...
now I heard that original team was only a few guys, right?
Well, the very original team, the Lightning project, was a small team. It quickly grew pretty large, and maybe even grew too quickly in retrospect. But essentially what we did is we figured out of our grand vision, maybe half of it we could implement in a reasonable period of time. Yeah. And so went ahead and did that. And that is what became the first release of the .NET framework and the associated tools on top of it. Yeah. I remember the year 2000 was a big deal for us because that's when we had our coming out party, told the world about all this stuff we were doing, and received a lot of positive attention from the developer community. And so what's happened since then is essentially we've been making this continually expanding bet on this new developer platform. We have a very high bar to meet. Win32, while it's difficult to program to, is very robust. It's very broadly used. There's outstanding tools around it. A tremendous amount of momentum has existed in Win32 over the years. Yeah. And so we're trying to exceed that in many areas and in some areas to match it because of the maturity that platform has. Yeah. So, to take it to today would be the release that we're about to do on November 7th. Is essentially the third release of the .NET framework in Visual Studio.NET. If you follow Microsoft, we usually do a pretty good job on V3.
Version 3 is always the one.
Yeah, that's always the killer.
We could talk about that later, why that is.
Push that on the stack for a moment. So anyway, we're really quite enthusiastic about VB being a very compelling release. We think we've dotted the I's, crossed the T's on a very complete, powerful developer platform. So that's where we are today. Where we're going, which is what you originally asked. Yeah. We have the WinFX technologies, the Windows Presentation Foundation, the Windows Communication Foundation, the Windows Workflow Foundation. They're going to be coming out synchronized with Windows Vista. View those as a superset of what we've done so far in the .NET framework. .NET framework is essentially the core of WinFX, and all these technologies are going to extend it in some pretty significant ways. Yep. Hopefully developers out there are getting the community technology previews we're doing of WinFX. We've got a release beta 2, which is we're targeting later this year. So people are
hopefully we'll have some Christmas presents for all the developers out there.
That's right. Here, Merry Christmas. Here's Windows.
Fingers crossed. See, my fingers are crossed.
So that's sort of the near-term future.
Yeah.
The longer term, though, is where it gets really interesting. There's a lot of uncertainty. What we do after WinFX runtime components in Vista just because of the time frames. But the general trend continues to be continuing to expand this .NET-based developer platform. That'll continue to be the primary developer platform that Microsoft uses. We're going to be using it in more and more areas, like the SharePoint things in Office 12, use workflow and other aspects of WinFX. WinFS, the file system database connection, is essentially going to be another major technology that we just recently had their first beta. We're going to continue to push on that stuff. Yeah. So view WinFX as a continually expanding developer platform aimed at providing the best ways, the easiest ways to develop modern applications.
Yeah, WinFS really excites me because I'm an RSS guy, and I store I store gigabytes of RSS now. And now that we have pretty good desktop search, it makes it real powerful. Yeah. And now I can see a whole range of apps that use that store in new ways.
Well, the WinFS vision to allow data types to be shared across applications, it's a very compelling vision. You don't have data that's private to an individual application so much. It's very easy for your apps to share it. So it's a very, very neat customer vision. The team's been making good progress. Yeah. And while we're not able to get it in Vista and the initial releases of the WinFX runtime components, the team continues to do well, and it's a big part of our long-term platform.
Yeah. On some of the boards, I see some of the naysayers are like, well, is Microsoft really using WinFX itself? Is Microsoft really betting on .NET? And I think we're starting to see some of the, like Windows Mac or Microsoft Max, the new photo sharing app.
That's a great example.
And Sparkle. Sparkle is built in WinFX itself.
Yep.
And so we're starting to see some apps, but there's still that perception out there that Microsoft really doesn't believe in .NET. How would you answer that?
Well, partly I'll answer by saying we're investing massive resources in .NET. I mean, the teams of people working on this are enormous, some of the larger engineering teams in the world. Secondly, we are investing deeply in a number of areas. You mentioned Max, there's Sparkle, there's what SharePoint and Office are doing with the Workflow Foundation, several other areas that are fairly deep use of these technologies. Yeah. One thing to keep in mind is that we don't, with .NET and WinFX, say, hey, that must go rewrite all your existing code to use this stuff. Yeah. Remember, our biggest benefit is making it easy to write applications. Well, if you have an existing large code base, it probably doesn't make sense to rewrite it for the sake of a rewrite. There's not enough benefit there. And that's what a lot of the internal large teams that take Word. Word is a very good, very robust application. It doesn't provide enough value to move to .NET to go rewrite Word. Instead, if you look at new areas where we're doing a lot of innovation or new projects, that's where a lot of the managed code .NET kind of usage is happening. And some of them are released like Max and Sparkle.
Xbox Live is on .NET.
Xbox Live on the server end, yeah.
I mean, they won an Emmy, too. So.
Yeah, that's right. On the server end, ASP.NET is essentially, it's full bore, everybody uses it. There's almost no web server development that doesn't use ASP.NET these days. So Microsoft is making very deep investments.
If it's on the Microsoft platform, right?
I'm biased.
I know a few Linux guys who would probably argue with that.
Absolutely correct.
What else would you like to tell us about, going into November?
Well, we're just really excited about the opportunity to release these two major projects, Woodby and Yukon. The database stuff that the SQL team has done with Yukon is really quite compelling. And in particular, the SQL CLR, the ability to write stored procedures in managed code, will take the .NET environment into one new area that'll be really great for making it easier to write certain kinds of...
I bet a few hours of meetings have been spent with you and the SQL Server team VPs trying to figure out how to integrate, right?
Well, it's a complex problem space because in some ways SQL is almost like its own operating system. I mean, they really control memory very carefully. The reliability constraints are very high with SQL. So they spend a lot of time getting their environment just right. And it's absolutely the case that there's been a lot of work between the two teams making sure to get the level of reliability and robustness and flexibility that is necessary in that environment.
Yeah. For those who, before I got here, I understood this because I worked with Microsoft a lot. It's really a separate company almost. Like SQL Server is, walking around here, it's like 100 separate companies under one roof.
A little bit. But we talked at the very beginning of this about how the company likes to push decisions toward the edge. And so that sometimes results in the feeling you just described where it's 100 companies under one roof.
And that also means that when you want to work with the SQL Server team, that's probably why both teams slow down a bit, because they have to really work on integrating themselves and integrating their technologies, right?
That's a good way to put it. There's a bit of an impedance matching that you have to do. They have slightly different processes and philosophies than we do, and so making those work well together on a shared project like SQL CLR, where it really is 50-50. Each team's equally responsible for half of it, and the bugs and the challenges have all been equally on both sides.
Yeah.
And so when you have teams with slightly different philosophies and practices, that's a little hard.
Are you finding best practices for working with other teams? I sense that even since working here, there's a lot of complaints that we move too slow and we don't ship, stuff on time or fast enough. And I'm sensing that we're speeding up as we learn a little bit better how to integrate some of these.
Well, I think that's absolutely happening inside the company. About a year ago, we had the large changes in Longhorn, and what we all realized is that we needed to take some fundamental steps with the way we were approaching engineering. We were still using some of our practices and our goals from the late 90s, yet our projects had gotten larger, the customer demands had gotten much higher. Like you look at security, customers have understandably and correctly very high demands for us on shipping super high quality, super secure software. Yeah. And so meeting those demands requires us to spend a lot more time scrubbing and polishing, making sure that we get everything just right. Yet we were still using some development practices that were a little too old, and we still were, I think, a little too ambitious about what we could get done in a given period of time.
Yeah.
I think the company has really recognized some of the challenges that we've had there, and we've gotten much more realistic about what we can do, when we can do it, the depth of integration that we can have. At the same time, there's a tension. It would be very natural as a developer to just go kind of want to do your own thing in a little team of 5 people, don't integrate it, just make something happen. Well, if you look at one of the major benefits that I think Microsoft provides is being able to integrate all these different kinds of technologies. SQL CLR is one good example. So we do face a tension there of wanting decision-making out on the edges, wanting to give people a lot of control over their individual projects, yet also working very hard to integrate the products appropriately, because that's what customers like most about a lot of what we do.
Yeah. The latest hype in the world is, web-based small team development, right? From small companies like 37 Signals to Google, right?
Yep.
Turning around a project and shipping it in a few months seems to be the rage. And a lot of those projects, I know guys at Google, and I know guys who are like the Start.com team here who are in that methodology, but they have 3, 4, I guess they have 6 people working on it now. There's a certain range of things you can do with 6 people.
Absolutely, that's what I was going to say.
But you still, where do you get the benefit from having a big team, having a team that can really do a different kind of a level of software project?
Well, if you look at some of the major challenges that we try and tackle at Microsoft, little teams couldn't do things like get great application compatibility in Windows. It's inherently a massive undertaking. It's one of our core fundamental values that, when you have Windows, it's going to run your application. It's the whole purpose of why you buy Windows. Yeah. So we spend a huge amount of time getting that compatibility. It's really hard to do it because oftentimes there's an implicit contract with any interface that you have into the system. And sometimes there are parts of that contract that an application takes advantage of that weren't intended in the original contract. So think of it as an application assuming a certain behavior that might change inadvertently with a legitimate bug fix, say a security bug fix under the covers, that breaks that application.
Yeah.
Fixing those is incredibly difficult. Keeping those applications working is a significantly high bar that you really can't do with a small team.
Yeah.
Small teams are great at innovating in new areas. They can run very fast, especially if it's an area that's relatively technically independent. And we have a lot of small teams at Microsoft that pursue it, Start.com being one example. Yeah. But there are certain classes of problem that are very important to our customers and very important to the problem space that small teams just aren't capable of addressing.
Interesting. Are you able to learn anything from the small teams?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think one thing that we've learned in the last couple of years at Microsoft is that breaking down the development into some less touch points. I think we were too far, the pendulum was too far to one side, and all these things have to be integrated, all these things have to work perfectly together. And we move the pendulum toward, okay, we're going to pick some touch points, some places where integration is especially effective. But we're also going to allow teams to run a little bit more independently. And that's been very beneficial to us because these massive software projects, keeping literally 10,000 people marching in the same direction that you have with a project like Windows, that's a lot of work. You have to be able to give teams some autonomy.
Yeah. Are we learning lessons that we're going to turn around and teach our customers? Because there's a lot of customers who have huge projects as well. And some of them, you know, well, okay, let's take it. I was in California, and the DMV bought a system from a competitor of ours, and it blew up. They lost hundreds of millions of dollars. So these kinds of huge software engineering problems are not ones that just Microsoft are facing, right?
Right.
And do you think we're going to be able to share some of that knowledge that we're gaining internally now, externally as well?
I think so. I think so. If you look at some of the things, especially that we're doing in the VS Enterprise SKUs, a lot of the learnings in there are implicitly, and here's what we learned about how to manage our own internal projects. Here's a tool that we need, you know, bug tracking or source control or those kinds of things. So we're actually putting them in our products in some ways to allow customers to have the same tools to do their own process. So yeah, and it's bi-directional too, I'll be clear here. You know, while we do a lot of software development and I think we're reasonably good at it, there's a bunch of customers out there who taught us a heck of a lot about how to develop our own software,
yeah.
You know, different approaches and ways of attacking things. And so I don't want to represent it as, you know, we know all.
No, absolutely.
Here's the information. It's a two-way street.
You certainly see that at shows like the PDC, where
Great example.
developers were bringing their machines in and talking to Microsofties and showing them stuff that they had learned on their own.
Yeah, it's really about the community in the industry that we have, and you know, we view our part of it as helping developers with some platform stuff and some tools to help them build their applications. But you can't build those without, you know, the application saying, hey, you know, this part you kind of screwed up. Your platform's busted here. Your tools can do this a lot better. And that two-way street is really what makes it effective for everybody.
Yeah. Can you give us any hints of what's going to come after Whitby?
Orcus is the code name.
Right.
The primary focus around Orcus for both parts of the division, both the Visual Studio, the tools parts, as well as the .NET platform parts, is going to be supporting Vista and Office 12.
Okay.
We basically want to make sure that we have a great job of tools, things like designers for the Presentation Foundation, the Communication Foundation, compilers that target those things well. We'll do probably a smaller release of .NET Framework technologies where the goal is to work really well with those tools, with the advances in Office and in Vista.
I'm already getting questions because of the new UI in Office 12 that was just shown off publicly at the PDC.
Yep.
People are already saying, how can I make my apps look like Office 12?
It's a common question. Everybody wants to look at Office and use that as kind of a metaphor for how they design their
So are you guys going to have a ribbon bar or something?
Don't know. Actually, plans there aren't super nailed down.
All right.
We are. I will say that we are looking at that and seeing what we can do in terms of, you know, making sure that customers can build apps with a consistent look and feel to the other parts of Vista and of Office.
Very cool. Well, thanks for spending half an hour with us.
Great, Robert. Thank you very much.
If there's anything else you want to talk with us about, let us know.
I will. Thank you very much.
Cool, thanks.